I must say, I am blessed by some pretty amazing colleagues. Teachers who do amazing work. Teachers who inspire their students, have great insight into their content, and who continually strive to improve their practice. They inspire me and make me want to improve. The world needs more of these leaders, and someday I hope to count myself among them, because it's the most important work. But it's really not enough, because we also have to take time to give voice to our work. Because if our best teachers are not given time and opportunity to advocate for our students in our profession, someone else will fill that silence. Too often, these are the voices of people whose only classroom experience is in the seat of a student. Our profession does not provide easy access for this. We work in a system that was built for another time. We teach in factories that move batches of students along at the bell. We might as well just put a conveyor belt in the hallway. We squeeze out every second of productivity we can. And our schools still fundamentally look very much the same they did over 100 years ago. And our careers are still very similar too. Except now, we're allowed to get married and have children, so I guess that's progress. Still, moving up in our career too often means leaving the classroom, leaving the students who are the very reason we began this endeavor in the first place. Which forces us to break new ground if we want to step beyond our classrooms without becoming a principal or going to work for another education agency, which is also important work, but not what I'm talking about today. Teacher leadership can be like climbing a rock face. Now let's be honest, I'm a physics teacher and I don't have a lot of rock climbing experience, but I really love metaphors. I really love a good metaphor, and in the absence of a good metaphor, we're going to work with this one. So from the ground, we see a relatively straight path from here to the top. It's not until we get into the climb that we start having to negotiate the precarious footholds and force us to go sideways or even backwards before we can move forward and up. And looking back from my current position, just a little bit up the rock, I can trace over the steps that led to my present hybrid teaching position, and I can see a clear path. But 10, 5, or even 2 years ago, looking forward, I saw a very different future. The job I have now certainly didn't exist. In fact, 3 years ago, neither program I work in had even been conceived. I never would have dreamed of the chance that I had to shape my own program. From the ground, it looks easy, and the footholds and hand grips, they appear obvious. You could easily coach someone standing at the ground looking up. However, when you get into it, some of those footholds turn out to be slippery. Some of those opportunities turn out to be risks. And perceived advantages can become challenges when you start working for change. Colleagues you collaborate with for teaching may not be as eager to collaborate when you start pushing your boundaries beyond the classroom wall. Many of those familiar and reassuring structures in our classroom for teaching can begin to feel unnecessary and even claustrophobic as impediments when you begin advocating for change. On the converse, some of the more threatening features on the rock turn into opportunities as you gain skill and confidence with your climb. That narrow crevice sure looks intimidating to me, but to someone who knows what they are doing, it's just the place to reach in and really grab hold. Perceived hindrances early in my career later turned into opportunities. For example, when I began working at Johnstown a decade ago, I saw its small size as a drawback. I was terrified to be the only physics teacher in the district and not have anyone to turn to for help as a beginning teacher with content, with unpacking my state standards, and understanding the impact of state mandates on my physics instruction. In those first years, I had no one to hand me a lesson plan or figure out the nuances of the AP Physics curriculum with me, and I was scared. It wasn't long, though, before I gained access to a network of physics teachers and collaborators very much from the Knoll Science Teaching Foundation as a network, who provided me with great inspiration and insight into many of the challenges I faced. So then when I was ready to make a major change in the Johnstown physics program, suddenly I was thankful that I was the only person I had to convince. A small school can be a great thing for getting to know and really reaching students. And since my early mistaken impressions of teaching in a small setting, I've learned to value the many opportunities it offers over the very few drawbacks. So I want to share a little bit more of my story, a little piece of my climb. So around the time, or just before I began National Board, just a few years into my career, I fell in love. I fell in love with project-based learning. I happened upon a workshop, and I thought, wow, this is something I can bite into, something I want to do with my students. So I attended another workshop, and thankfully, from the support from the Knoll Science Teaching Foundation, I was able to gather a group of colleagues across the nation that I could dig into this with, share ideas, resources, and troubleshoot the many, many, many problems. And I began the work of transforming my classroom from the more traditional physics classroom that I had been educated in to something that was embedded in real-world work and problems and project-based learning. Because I have a big mouth, I didn't stop talking about it. And I managed to convince some administrators to let me put on a workshop over the summer for colleagues in the Johnstown School District. I wanted to do this workshop selfishly because I was looking for some collaborators that were in my own district, even in my own state. And we had 13 teachers attend that first workshop. And then we put on another one the following summer. And I started to see pieces of project-based learning projects on the copier left behind that I didn't even know about in the years that came. I think in part because of my work on this topic, but also my involvement in some other committees and focusing on professional development for my district, I was later invited to a conversation. This was a conversation among the district administrators, principals, and a handful of teachers to talk about the future of our school district. Now, this was a lofty conversation, and it didn't have any particular tangible goals at the time. But we started to talk about if we could do anything to change our classrooms, to change our schools, what would we do? And many of us felt that we needed to give our kids more authentic experiences, and that we needed to start breaking down the silos between the departments in the secondary level, and start looking at how knowledge connects and how it lives and plays in the real world. I told my leaders at the Knoll Science Teaching Foundation about this conversation. And so later that year, when I had a chance to run a national board candidacy writing retreat, modeled after one I had seen Annette put on, for Knoll Science teachers in Philadelphia, they said, Heather, why don't you extend your visit? Come down a day early. We want you to visit some schools that might inspire the conversation you're having with your administration. So I had to go and plead for that extra day, for that extra sub. And when I did so, something funny happened. My superintendent and assistant superintendent said, sure, you can go, but we're going to follow you. And they did. They showed up in Philly, right on my heels, and we went together to visit a school. The school was called the Sustainability Workshop, and it was run by Simon Hogger, who was a teacher and is now a teacher, leader, and principal. This was a pilot school in its first year. They had 2 teachers, 30 students, and a nearly abandoned Victorian home that they called their school. And those teachers and students worked together, integrating all the subject areas the students were studying in their senior year: math, science, physics, and English. And we saw how those students were integrating that work in real-world projects, getting passionate about real-world problems. After that visit, my administration went back. I went to my writing retreat. But then when I returned to school the next week, I was met with a surprise. I was invited down to the superintendent's office, and they asked me, "So Heather, what if we freed you up for half a day next year? What if you could work with another teacher? What if we gave you a group of students? What would you do?" I couldn't believe that they were putting that level of trust in us. And we built it. We built what we called the Learning Project. And we're now in our second year of that program, myself and my co-teacher, Ann Baggett, who's probably the one hiding behind her coffee mug up there. We work with seniors from Johnstown High School in project-based learning where we combine English, physics, statistics, participation in government, and economics. And we look at where the content lives in the real world, and we have our students engaged in projects involved in the real world. But that wasn't it. Because last year, I did take a maternity leave and had my daughter in December. And when I returned from my maternity, actually weeks before I turned my maternity leave, I popped my head back into the district to pick up some paperwork and to show off my baby girl. And the superintendent and assistant superintendent grabbed me again. And they said, "Heather, what if when you came back from your maternity leave, we didn't send you back to your normal afternoons at the regular high school? We're going to keep your replacement. She's doing a great job." And she is. She's doing a fantastic job. And I'm honored that she was actually my physics student once upon a time. But they had another plan for me in the afternoons, because the Hamilton, Fulton, Montgomery BOCES have received a P-TECH grant to start a Pathways in Technology early college high school. And they wanted to model that program, the instruction in that program, after the project-based learning that Ann and I had been doing the past year. And so they asked me to be an instructional coach. And so I got to spend the remainder of last school year teaching in the morning with Ann and planning with the new principal for HF and P-TECH. And now this year, I spend my morning still teaching with my kids, with Ann. And in the afternoons, I'm coaching and working with the teachers in P-TECH to do project-based learning with those students. I never would have dreamed of this role, because I get to do things I'm really passionate about, but I still get to be in the classroom. And I still get to be grounded every day with kids, met with the frustration and the tears of knowing I'm not reaching them the way I want to reach them, but knowing that I have tomorrow to try harder. Rock climbing and leadership have another common thread. We need knowledge and skills to do what we do and do it safely. While I won't be signing up for rock climbing classes anytime soon, I did sign up for teacher leader training unknowingly about 5 years ago when I walked into a room at the Sand Creek Middle School for an information session about National Board led by Annette Romano. Candidacy helped me take a critical lens to my work as a teacher. It taught me how to ask better questions about my students, myself, and the systems in which I worked. It forced me to take time for reflection, which I always knew was somehow important, but the power of which I had not yet internalized and never really made time for. But most importantly, the years I spent working on my portfolios helped me to find my voice. With the support of Annette, other NBCTs, many in this room, and the candidates of my support group, as well as my colleagues back in my home district, I began learning how to articulate my practice more clearly, convincingly, and concisely. Well, maybe I'm not so concise this morning, but from writing came speaking. I'm kind of a verbal thinker, if there is such a thing, and anytime I need to work out a new idea, I do best by talking it through. You can just ask the amazingly patient Ann. But more importantly, National Board got me to start talking seriously with others about teaching. Beyond discussions of difficult students in the faculty room or of tricky bits of content with other physics teachers, the certification process provided a reason and a framework for talking about the very essence of our work. After certifying, I had the amazing opportunity to serve on the committee to revise national board standards for accomplished science teaching. Rarely is there an occasion for 10 to 12 science teachers and other science education professionals to sit around a table for hours and hash out what it really means to be a science teacher. I think these meetings totaled 25 days over the course of a year. It was grueling work, but it was also a thrilling luxury to spend so much time simply thinking, talking, and writing about teaching. But immediately before my work on that committee began, I found myself in a situation I fear is all too common in our present and our future. I was in a conference room full of experts in science education, the who's who list, who were prepared to decide whether or not those standards need to be revised. And when I, as the only active classroom teacher in the room, finally had an opportunity to chime in and give my opinion, they listened. They were impressed by what I had to say, maybe even a bit surprised. Maybe I should have been flattered. I think I was at the time. But thinking back to that, I'm not flattered at all. In fact, I'm pretty irritated. Anyone who is that surprised and impressed with what I had to say has clearly not taken the time to sit down and listen to a teacher. Perhaps against a room of other non-teacher professionals, I had a great deal of insight into the classroom. But I can't hold a candle to most of the people in this room. Maybe it's because adults have spent 12 plus years sitting in our place of work as children that everyone thinks they know as much, or maybe even more, than the teachers. So like the experienced rock climbers who you make it look easy. So now we have to face our rock walls. We have to take risks, and we have to speak out for our students, our classrooms, our colleagues, our schools, and our profession. Today, you're going to hear about some pretty amazing climbs, and maybe even start planning some new treks of your own. We have to seize the existing opportunities. We have to create new ones. This is our profession, and if we don't speak up, someone else will. Thank you.
It is kind of funny that as a teacher, I'm terrified of public speaking. Students I can handle. So the topic was the idea of grit. And I think the story that I'll share, a lot of you can relate to. In 7th grade, I walked into my English class, and the English teacher gave us an assignment. The assignment was to rewrite a fairy tale, but you had to rewrite it from a different character's point of view. So I chose Rumpelstiltskin, and I wrote it from the point of view of Rumpelstiltskin, and really analyzed the question, why on earth does he want that baby? And the English teacher did an absolutely amazing job of teaching me how to write a story. And I left that assignment going, I have never done that before, and I feel really successful. And it was in that moment that I decided I'm going to be a teacher. 7th grade. We're going back more years than I'm going to count. And from that point on, I created a file folder. So in every English class I walked into, I collected and kept the assignments that I would one day want to use in my own classroom. And I kept my workings of the assignment. So I have the assignment in this file folder, and I have the work that I did. 8th grade I did this, 9th grade I did this, 10th grade. I have an English teacher, and we get into poetry. And I was excited because at the time, the English teacher was a poet. And I'm thinking, wow, I could be an English teacher and I can write on my own. And I can give the assignments to my kids and have them analyze my writing. Win-win. So we worked through a lot of poetry. And he taught us how to dissect a poem, and he taught us how to pull meaning, and all the things that English teachers do well. And he gave us assignment, gave us this poem, and for homework or to complete the assignment, we had to do it independently. I have this. I complete the assignment, I hand it in, I'm really, really happy and really proud of it until I get the grade. I failed. And on one hand, I'm really discouraged. I'm really upset that, wow, this English teacher is telling me that my interpretation is not only a B or a C, it's an F. So in that moment, when I could have said, I'm not doing this, I decided that I'm going to be the type of English teacher where I encourage more than one answer. I kept the assignment in my file folder. 11th, 12th, I'm still collecting assignments. I go away to college in 1996, and I am still eager to be a teacher, that I graduate early. I give up my summers. I take extra classes. Instead of the typical 15, I take 18. I push myself because I know I want to do this. This is what I'm supposed to do. I graduate. And yes, I'm still adding to my file folder from my college professors now. And then I go and apply for my master's. To show how serious I am, that I still want to be a teacher even after all these years, I schedule an interview. And I sit with the director of the program, and I bring with me my file folder. And I set it down, and I go, these are all the reasons. These are the things that supported me in my journey and have encouraged me to keep going even when sometimes I don't want to. And I get into the program, I get my master's, and then begins the interview process. One of the things you do when you get your master's is you spend a lot of time reflecting on the teachers in your life. Do you remember that paper where you're, who is the teacher that inspired you? Who's the teacher? Well, I did that. I did several of those papers. And there was this one teacher in particular that I liked him so much, I even took Latin. Latin. And he was one of many that really made me commit to this journey. So the interview process begins when you're about to get your master's. You go out and you start going on interviews. I went on 11. During one of the interviews, they asked me a whole bunch of questions, and at the end of the interview, they said, thank you, but you're too creative. Okay. On another interview, I walked in, the air conditioning was broken, it was a really hot day, and the superintendent didn't know my name, hadn't looked at my resume. It lasted for 10 minutes, and I was out the door. Next. Going through this process, very humbling, very discouraging. It's very difficult. Then I come to my alma mater. And I find out that the teacher that I took Latin, that I followed throughout my high school career, he's the assistant superintendent. And I'm thinking, I get to finally say thank you. I'm going to walk in, I'm going to reintroduce myself, because I'm not going to assume he remembers me. But I have this moment. I spent a whole year reflecting on teaching practices. This is the guy. So I show up for the interview. He comes out of the room that they're going to hold the interview. He says, hi, how are you? Great. Clearly he doesn't recognize me. He says, can we talk for a minute? Sure. He pulls me into another room. We sit down at the table, and he says, well, I'm glad you applied. I see that you went here. I just want to let you know that just because you went here, don't expect a job. Okay, so I'm not going to say thank you right now. We walk out of the room, and I walk into the interview that lasts for 45 minutes. I absolutely cannot tell you one thing I said because I was gone. Mentally, that was like as low as you could possibly go in that process. On the 12th interview, I got hired. I hung in there. And I have been with Schenectady for the last 14 years, for my entire teaching career. And I am happy. That file folder that has sustained me and has followed me, it's in my classroom, although the assignments no longer fit with Common Core. They are still in my filing cabinet in my classroom, and they have moved from middle school up to the high school. And they are the reminder that I still have the passion, no matter how difficult it is, no matter what gets thrown at us. Someone said earlier about on the card about taking punches. No matter what it is, that's my life raft. That has been my driving force, and that has sustained me through the challenges that we face on a daily basis. And again, it's in my classroom, and it just is my focus and why I do what I do. Thanks.
I fall in love really easily, and my first true deep love was my 5th grade teacher. And when I got appendicitis, she came to visit me, and that's when I realized it was mutual. But it didn't work out. But I do want to tell you about 3 women that I do love: Jacqueline, Michelle, and Bernice. Jacqueline's my wife, and she's tall, she's brilliant, she's beautiful, and it's hard for me to convince her of any of that. But she is constantly bombarded with males complimenting her on her appearance. Excuse me. A few years ago, she was working with a little boy. She's a school social worker in Glens Falls. So these are the males that compliment her. They're 2nd, 1st graders. And she, like most of us, likes a compliment. So when a little boy said, "Mrs. Tyner, you used to be a ballet dancer, didn't you?" she immediately thought, maybe I'm slender, graceful. So as a social worker, she knew to ask for more. She said, "So what is it about me that makes you think I danced ballet?" He said, "Well, when you walk, your feet go out like this." And so the compliment was gone. And another little boy was in a bad mood, and she was trying to bring him down a little bit, calm him down. And he said, out of the blue, he said, "All right, Mrs. Tyner, what did you do before you were a teacher?" She said, "Well, what do you mean?" "You know, what was your job before you were a teacher?" And she said, as a therapist would, "Well, what do you think I did before I was a teacher?" He said, "I know, clown with all those teeth." She has a large, beautiful smile. But the third boy spoke of her appearance. He met her in the hallway after vacation, and he was so thrilled to see her that he walked up to her, and he's this tall, so he put his arms around her and he hugged tight, put his head against her, and then he looked up and he said, "Mrs. Tyner, you know you have skinny parts and squishy parts?" And she pushed him away and decided he was too old now to be hugging anymore in the hallway. So I try that line with her sometimes, like, "Babe, you've got skinny parts and squishy parts." And it doesn't help with me either. So it was quite a juxtaposition when last winter I found myself in Mass General Hospital with her, cutting her long hair down so it was just above her scalp, and then holding her hand as they did a lumbar puncture to see if the leukemia that she'd been diagnosed with had invaded her spinal column. And then to watch as they poured toxins into her body to destroy her immune system. This beautiful, strong, vivacious woman, she just shriveled over a period of days and weeks. And I was lucky enough to spend the time with her. I sat in her room, in her hospital room. They gave me a bed, so I stayed right there for a full month. And I remember one night, just looking out over the city of Boston, and it was beautiful. The stars were out and the lights of Boston were out. And I turned and looked at her, and she was asleep, and she had pain on her face. Her forehead was furrowed, and that was her sleep. That was her escape. And I got up, and I left the room and walked down the hall, and I'm all alone, and I'm just thinking about my wife and praying to God that he would just take her because she was in so much pain. And I walked down the hall, and I looked out a window on the other side of the building, and I was confronted with the other side of the hospital, and I could see floor after floor after floor. And the windows were all, no blinds, and I could look in and I see person after person after person in similar situations. People sick, people with their families there. And I just thought, this is a hard life. How do you move on through things like this? And the story is not unique to me, it's not unique to Jacqueline. We all know people, we all will have people we love who live through hard times. And it brings me to the point of the talk, which is resilience. That's one of the elements of grit, is resilience, being able to move on. And it makes me think of, by the way, she is doing well. She came through the transplant quite well. Initially, they'd given her about a 10% chance of surviving. So we were planning her funeral together. She made it through. She's home now. She's doing well. But she never got bitter, and she was never depressed. She just kept a positive attitude and said, I don't know if I'll live or if I'll die, but if I do live, I want to keep on living, not just staying alive. And that's sort of how she's been since then. And I wonder, what is it about her that makes her press on? And it reminded me of the first time that I ever met her family. So this is the second woman I want to talk about, her sister Michelle. Michelle is nothing like Jacqueline. Michelle's 6'3", 350 pounds, developmentally disabled quite significantly. But the one thing she does know how to do really well is to figure out what will make people the most uncomfortable in the room and do it. So I went to meet Jacqueline's family after we'd gotten engaged, which is sort of an awkward situation because they want to know who is this guy that is going to spend the rest of his life with our sister, our daughter. And so you're there to sell yourself. And she has 75 siblings. They're Irish Catholic. They're all over 7 feet tall. When they sit down to have a meal, they have a beer in each hand and they're loud, which was perfect because I could shrivel into the corner and sort of be inconspicuous. But they are Catholic, and so when my brother-in-law said grace, for a split second afterward it was quiet. And in that quietness, Michelle leaned out over the table and looked down at me and said, So, Randy, are you sleeping with my sister? And if it was a movie, it would have been a still frame with everyone looking at me and just the sound of my heart beating. And I leaned out and I said, not yet, Michelle, but I can't wait to. And all the siblings and the mothers breathed a sigh of relief and laughed and went on with their eating. But I watched her mother, that's the third woman, Bernice, I watched her at this meal, and she was so happy. She's a widow, her husband had died, but she was so happy, laughing and talking and bringing out big vats of chowder and cutting up homemade bread. She was a delightful woman, and I got to know her over the course of my life. She always looked that way. She was always gracious and giving. And if you looked at her, you'd think, wow, this woman has had an easy life. She's contented. Then I got to know her life. Bernice was born in Pennsylvania in a poor family. When she was 9, her mother got cancer, and Bernice had to take over a lot of the household chores. She made bread before school, so her family would have bread to eat in the evening. When she was 16, her mother died. When she was 17, a knock came at the door, and it was somebody from the coal mine who said, I'm really sorry, but your brother was just killed in a coal mining accident. She had a boyfriend. That took her away from her family. She finally had something positive in her life, but World War II came. He went off to the war, and he wrote her letters saying that it was over. Partly, I think he didn't want her to be a widow or to be mourning, so he cut her free. At 19, she met another guy, fell in love, got married. On their first month anniversary, They were out together and on their way home, got in a car accident, and he was killed. And she crawled 3/4 of a mile to a house, knocked on the door in the middle of the night, and they took her in. She picked up the pieces and she moved on. James came home from the war. They got married. They had 3 beautiful boys. And James, Patrick, Vince, and Dennis. And one night when her husband came home from work late at night, he came in and he went to kiss their 2-month-old baby, Dennis, goodnight, and Dennis was cold and had died of SIDS. So here's this woman. She's lost her mother, her brother, her first husband, her baby. She's lived in poverty her whole life. Eventually, she had more children. One of them was Michelle, who was pretty significantly developmentally disabled and was an enormous amount of work to take care of her, and pain. One day, Michelle came home from school, and she was crying, she was hysterical, and blood was running down her legs. And they finally calmed her down, and Bernice said, "Michelle, what happened?" And apparently some neighborhood boys had been picking on her and throwing rocks at her legs because she was developmentally disabled. Those are the things that Bernice had to deal with. So when I met her on that day, and I thought, this woman is just so kind, I love her. We did, we fell in love, we had a great relationship. But I don't know how she did it. Because when I think of grit, I think of people becoming tough as leather, hard as nails, and gritting their way through. Somehow she went through life with all that pain and maintained grace and hope and optimism and joy. I have no idea how she did it. But when I look at my wife today and I see her living like that, I think maybe it's something that my wife Jacqueline learned from her mother, from the way her mother modeled it. And my hope is that as teachers, we can influence our students a little bit by letting them see us, letting them see our lives. And when we do encounter pain, modeling what it is to get up and move on and come to school and be hopeful. Because in the end, I think that is probably our biggest influence on them, is who we are, not just what we tell them. Thank you.
So I've been a teacher for over a decade, always at the middle grades, 5th, 6th, 7th, or 8th, always in urban areas, Los Angeles, Oakland, the Bronx, and always in high-need schools. It's what I love, it's where I'm supposed to be, it's my passion. My 10th year of teaching, my school got a new principal, and it was the first time that I ever had a fundamental difference of opinion with the school leader. And that relationship got me thinking about who makes decisions in education, who decides who my principal is going to be, and what impact can I have as a teacher on that decision. That same principal, that same year, encouraged me to apply for a fellowship away from my school in Washington, D.C. She encouraged me to apply for a fellowship at the U.S. Department of Education, where they bring together a small cohort of teachers from across the country to come and learn about education policy and be a teacher voice at the federal level. So I applied for that fellowship, and I got it. And so I packed up my New York City apartment and moved to Washington, D.C. for the year, where I was advocating for the middle grades and the importance of the middle grades at the federal level. It was an amazing year. I learned a ton, but I learned very quickly that I am not meant to work in a cubicle. I'm not meant to sit at a computer all day and to be surrounded by 4 gray walls and to pick up a phone to call someone who's 10 feet away from me when I want to have a conversation with them. And even though I knew that, and I knew I was really missing teaching and missing kids, when that year was up, I took another job at the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, where for 2 years I helped organize some of our country's more than 100,000 National Board certified teachers. And while I loved that work and I loved my colleagues, I wasn't as happy as I wanted to be. And so I made the decision to return to the classroom. And I wanted to return to my beloved community of Hunts Point in the South Bronx. I wanted to return to my beloved middle schoolers, and I really wanted to return to my roots. I was ready. I was ready to make a difference. I was ready to make change. I was ready to have a direct impact. I quickly found out I was not as ready as I thought I was, because on that very first day of this school year, September 2014, it was very clear that I was struggling. And students actually are very chill pretty much the first week, 2 of school. They're figuring you out, you're figuring them out. But that was not the case with my kids this year in my class. Now, I struggled with classroom management my first and second year of teaching. But years 3 through 10, it was a breeze. Classroom management didn't really faze me. And so I was wondering what was happening in my 11th year of teaching that made it so hard. Here I am, this national board certified teacher, the only one in my school until next year. We're going to have, 3 years from now, we'll have a few more. I was really struggling. And so, why was Brahim, one of my students, yelling, "Your mother," across the room multiple times during a lesson? Why was Antonio taking erasers and flinging them at his friends and enemies during class, and sometimes keeping them connected to the pencil but trying to lodge it into the ear of the student in front of him? Why did my 8th grade ELA colleague come for friendly peer observation, hang out for about 10 minutes and say, "I'm going to come back when it's a little less crazy"? And why did Angela feel like it was okay to say, "I don't give a beep," when I asked her to put away her lip gloss and get started on the assignment? So clearly I was struggling, right? Struggling with management. And so, it was my 11th year of teaching, but more often than not, it felt like my first. And so I did what all good National Board Certified teachers do, what all reflective practitioners do. I took a step back and I thought about what's most important to me as a teacher. What are my core values and beliefs? And I immediately thought about the first core proposition of the National Board, right? That teachers are committed to their students and their learning, that we are committed to our students and their learning. And I thought, I'm incredibly committed to my kids, but it was pretty clear to me that they didn't realize how committed I was. I had struggled with building relationships with them. I have close to 90 students. Some of them I see for only 48 minutes a day. And so I was struggling with that. So I did some reflecting and I created something called Dessert with Miss DeBose. Dessert with Miss DeBose is the last 15 or 20 minutes of the lunch period, where every day I'll bring up 3 students, 1 from each of my cohorts, and our task is to come up with 4 things that we have in common. And we sit down at a table with a tablecloth, we have sparkling water, we have cookies, we have napkins, and we have conversation. And we start to share stories and get to know each other. And so through that, I learned that one group of students and I, something we shared in common was that we had all traveled to a different country. Brahim, the student who's yelling "your mother" across my classroom, had recently traveled to his parents' home country of Yemen. And in his mind, Yemen was wild and crazy and you could do anything you want there, drive any way you wanted, and you wouldn't get in trouble. So that was his middle school view of his parents' home country. I learned that with Boubacar and Beatrice and Jaylette, we all had brothers, we all loved playing sports, and we all spoke a different language. So I was starting to build more of these relationships with kids, but I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see in my classroom. We were still struggling when there were 30 of them in the room at a time. So I stepped back and I did more reflection. And I thought about the 5th core proposition of the National Board, which is that we as teachers are members of learning communities. And so I talked to my assistant principal, and we sat down and we had sessions reflecting on what do I need to do in classroom management, strategies, what had she seen when she had come in. I stole ideas from our science teacher, I stole ideas from the social studies teacher down the hall. I put out pleas on Facebook, "I'm really struggling with this is what's happening." And my community of friends and family and fellow educators showered me with support and ideas. And I tried some of them and I implemented some worked, some didn't. And I wasn't still seeing the change that I wanted to see. So I did more reflecting and I thought about the 2nd core proposition, which is that teachers know the subjects they teach and how to teach those subjects to students. And if any of you, which I know you do, know anything about middle schoolers, you know that they care very deeply about issues of justice, fairness, and that they really want their voices to be heard. And so I felt like I was hearing my students, but clearly, with what was going on in our classroom, that wasn't the case. And so I instituted something called Anonymous Friday Feedback Forms, where my co-teachers and I would give our students a short survey every other Friday with simple questions like, what do you like about our class and why? What would you change? What strategies do you have for us as your teachers? And it was all anonymous, and while some of those feedback forms were very hard to read when you're riding the bus home on a Friday, and what do you like about our class? Nothing. What do you need to change? Everything. Classic middle school responses. What what advice do you have for your teachers? Tell Miss DeBose not to be so mean. You know, things like that. So some of them were hard to read, but they were all incredibly insightful. And one piece of feedback really stuck with me. It said, if students like the work, we'll do it. And so I reflected on that, and I was thinking about our next unit, and I said, I don't think students are going to like this unit. I don't think they're going to be as engaged in it. And so I created a flyer, and I invited every single one of my 97th graders to come to an after-school planning meeting on a Friday after school. Of course, there would be cookies. Of course, there'd be sparkling water. And we would sit around a table and we'd plan this next unit together. This was something I had never done before. And 10 of my 90 students showed up. And so we sat around a table. We ate cookies, meringues from Trader Joe's, and had our sparkling water. And I gave them just the theme of our unit is all around scholar activism. But the canvas is blank, so what should we do? And we talked about what a scholar is, we talked about what an activist is, and we started to brainstorm ideas. They told me they wanted to include more technology. They wanted to use their devices and their phones in our classroom. They said they wanted to do more group work and have more time to collaborate with and choose their own groups. It's very big in middle school. They told me that they wanted to take more field trips and get out of the building more, and that they wanted to do more arts integration. One of my kids said, when you see a lot of beautiful art around the room, it makes you want to learn and be more engaged, and we want to do more of that. And so I took their ideas, and we co-planned that unit, and this Monday we started our brand new unit of what does it mean to be a scholar activist. And while engagement is definitely up, and kids are able to make more of those connections to their lives, management is still not where I want it to be. And you know, every single day is different. Some days my kids and I are amazingly in the zone, and I can just step back and watch them give amazing peer feedback to each other during writing workshop. And other days, Bashar is still yelling, "Your mother," across the room. Gerald repeatedly ignores me after I've called his name 4 times. And Juliet doesn't seem to mind that I need to call her mom again for the 3rd night in a row. And on days like that, I go home, and sometimes I run or I swim, because that's an outlet for me. Sometimes I call my sister and I cry. Sometimes I sit on my couch and eat ice cream and watch episodes of Scandal and Modern Family, because you just need a break. But every day, always, 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 I go to sleep, and I know that tomorrow is a new day. Tomorrow is a new beginning. It's a fresh start, not only for me, but for my students. And that I know that this is exactly where I'm supposed to be, that our profession is incredibly intellectually challenging, physically exhausting, emotionally demanding, but that even though my management is not where I want it to be, I'm exactly where I should be. And in order to get better, on the days when it's really hard, I will just continue to step back and reflect, continue to build relationships with my students and their families, continue to collaborate with my colleagues, and get a little bit better every single day. Thanks.